As the person approached, I began to make out more and more of their features, and soon they were standing directly beneath me. It was definitely a guy, and he seemed familiar to me. He appeared to be waiting. I started to get rather anxious as I knew I couldn't waste time in getting home and getting help for Kit, when suddenly the guy turned and looked directly up at me in the tree. It was only then that I recognized him. Welcome aboard the Strange Express. My name is Dr. Scherzo Stantio. The story that you're about to hear was told to me by a friend. He absolutely insists that the story is true, as incredible as it seems. Over the years, he states that he has formed an opinion about what happened, and he will share that with you in just a bit. But now, please find a seat and make yourself comfortable, as I believe I just heard the engineer give the signal that today's journey is about to begin. I was somewhat of an adventurous child. My mother has related many stories how I'm personally responsible for her gray hair. It's true, when I was 2 I drank motor oil reclaimed from an old tractor. Fortunately it is not detergent oil, so the main consequence was that perhaps it's best I not go into that, as someone may be eating while watching this. Then there was a time I climbed a tree close to our house and somehow managed to get onto the roof of the house. And I couldn't get down because I couldn't get back into the tree. The one that frightened her most was the time that I sneaked out of the house, and when she found me, I'd wandered a good bit down the dirt road that ran in front of our house. She saw that I was talking to a man in a truck, and my mother could tell he was trying to convince me to get in the truck with him. She said she ran out of the house screaming, and the guy took off as soon as he saw her. Now, these things took place many years ago, and we lived way out in the country. Many of the people living there were small farmers, including my family. This particular story happened when I was 6 years old. Growing up on a farm, we children all had assigned chores to do. Having finished my afternoon chores, I went over to where my brother, Kit, was working, and I helped him finish his chores, so we could both go and play until supper time. Now, my brother was 7 years my senior, and I suspect at that time he saw me as more of a nuisance than anything else. But I pretty much followed him wherever he went, and did whatever he did. Many times back then he would look at me with an exasperated expression and say, "Troy, you have to follow me everywhere I go and do everything I do." I'd just give him a big, fake, cheesy grin, and he would sigh and walk away. And I would, of course, follow him. This particular day, we headed out to the woods that bordered on the fields at the edge of our farm. Now, we'd gone into these woods on many occasions, and most of the places we went I was familiar with. On this particular summer day, though, Kit went much deeper into the woods than we usually went. I didn't like it, as I realized we were getting pretty far from home, and I knew that if we were late getting back and caused supper to be delayed, we would probably get grounded and wouldn't be allowed to leave the property after chores were done for a week or 2. I mentioned this to Kit, but he told me there was something he wanted me to see. So we forged on. We finally arrived at the place that Kit had wanted me to see, but it was already getting pretty dark out. I asked him what was so special about the place. He didn't say anything, but pointed his finger towards some large old oak trees. I looked where he had been pointing, and there was hanging down from the trees a couple of frayed ropes. Immediately I yelled out, "Tarzan swings!" and Kit grinned. I then asked if he thought they would be safe, as they did look old and extremely frayed. Kit assured me that he had found them a couple of weeks earlier when I had been confined to bed due to a very bad case of the flu, and he had tested them out, and they were safe. We climbed up and started swinging on the ropes in our best imitation of the famed ape man. With each swing, our confidence was built, and we found higher and higher launching points to swing from. Finally, Kit climbed way up in a tree and perched, rope swing in hand, as he called out to me, "Watch this!" I looked, and quite honestly, I had no fear at the time that anything bad could happen. We'd been swinging on the ropes for several minutes, and they seemed strong enough. Unfortunately, it was not the ropes that we should have been concerned about. Kit dropped from the limb that he had been on, and quickly the rope became taut. As it did, we heard a loud snap, and the limb that supported the rope swing broke off from the tree. Kit, the rope, the limb, all hit the ground. Kit was trapped under the large tree limb and was moaning when I approached. I asked Kit if he was all right, but all he did was continue to moan. I tried to get the limb off of him, but it was too large for me to lift, and Kit screamed when I tried. He then whimpered that he thought that his leg was broken, that I'd need to go home and get our dad. It was at that point that the seriousness of our dilemma dawned on me. Dusk was seriously upon us, and the thick woods made it even worse. Also, I was unfamiliar with this part of the woods, and was not even sure which direction home was in. Swinging on the swings had disoriented me. I said to Kit, almost in tears, that I was not sure of the way home. Kit's hand shot out from amidst the greenery of the falling tree limb, and he pointed in a direction and said, "It's that way. We just came from there. Just go back the way we came. When you get to the heart, just turn left." His directions did not inspire a great deal of confidence, but I started out, although not too quickly, in the direction he had pointed, hoping to find the heart so that I could get my bearings. The heart was a tree that someone had carved a big heart in. At one time, it probably had the initials of some boy and his girlfriend carved in the center of the heart, but if the initials were ever there, they had now faded into oblivion, but the heart was still clearly visible. It was a landmark that I was familiar with and knew how to get home from there. Unfortunately, after several minutes of traveling, I did not see the heart or anything that looked familiar. As I walked on, I began to feel sick. Had I somehow missed the heart tree? My imagination began to develop fears within me. I was afraid that my brother might die and it would be my fault because I couldn't find my way back home. Even though it was still August, it was late August and autumn was in the air, and I started to feel the bite of chilled air. I began to wish that I had dressed a bit warmer, but there was no hint of cold when we had left our house. I still had chest congestion and a terrible cough lingering from my recent bout with the flu, and the chill reminded me of the chills that plagued me when I was so sick. I whispered a little prayer that my dad would come out and find me as I continued on my way. A few more minutes went by when I suddenly caught a glimpse of movement just ahead of me. I wasn't sure of what it was, and I felt that it might be wise to conceal my presence until I verified that it was human and that it was someone that I knew. After all, I wouldn't approach just anybody wandering around in the woods in the growing darkness. I crouched behind a tree and watched, but I couldn't see anything, so I climbed a tree to get a better look. Once I climbed a tree, I could see that it was indeed a person, but surprisingly, it didn't appear to be an adult. But there was not enough light to be able to identify who it was. One thing was certain, though. The person was traveling in my direction. As the person approached, I began to make out more and more of their features, and soon they were standing directly beneath me. It was definitely a guy, and he seemed familiar to me. He appeared to be waiting. I started to get rather anxious as I knew I couldn't waste time in getting home and getting help for Kit, when suddenly the guy turned and looked directly up at me in the tree. It was only then that I recognized him. It was Dwayne Mullins. It was strange to see Dwayne here, so close to my house. This Dwayne lived almost 3 miles away in an area known as Key Farms. Key Farms was a farming co-op made up of farming families, most of which were very close to, if not, poverty level. Now when school was in, Dwayne rode the same school bus as Kit and I rode. He was older than I, but younger than Kit. I'd always liked Dwayne, as he was very friendly to me, and he always sat by me on the bus since Kit would have nothing to do with me, always choosing to sit with others closer to his own age. Dwayne would sit next to me and he would draw cool pictures. Everything from cartoon characters to spaceships, race cars, and an occasional flying saucer. He would complete his art and then pass over the notebook to me, and I'd draw pictures too, but mine were really pitiful scribbles. I do remember his drawings were quite amazing in detail, and his cartoons were funny. Nevertheless, he always seemed to enjoy my childish offerings too. I considered Dwayne a good friend, even though he never spoke a word to me. You see, Dwayne was born not being able to hear or speak. As I mentioned, it seemed strange to see Dwayne so far from his home, but I figured that since school was currently out, that he, like Kit and I, had ventured far from home. When I dropped out of the tree, Dwayne stared at me as though he was trying to communicate something to me. And although I knew he could not hear me, I told him that Kit had been hurt and I was trying to get home to get my dad, but I had gotten lost. I don't know if he understood, but then he turned and started walking. I didn't follow him as I wasn't sure where he was going. After traveling some distance, he stopped, turned, and looked back at me, and waved me on to follow him. And he turned around and started to walk again, and I ran after him and followed him. And it was not too long before we entered a part of the woods that I recognized. As soon as we entered the familiar area, I took off running for home. I burst into our house and found my dad. Before I could say anything, he said to me, "It's about time." I was just about to go out looking for you and your brother." He started to say more, but I interrupted him by blurting out that a tree limb had fallen on Kit and that he was hurt and needed help right away. Within a minute or two, my dad had put his boots back on and had armed himself with a big hunting lantern and his bow saw, and we both put on jackets and headed for the heart. Once we got there, my dad asked me which way we needed to go. I told him that Kit had said that when I got to the heart, I would need to turn left to get back home. So we made a right turn, and we started calling out to Kit. And before long, we heard him answering. We made our way over to him, and my dad was able to lift the limb off Kit and carry him back home. As my dad drove my mom and me and Kit to the hospital to get Kit checked out, Kit began to tease me and said he was starting to believe that I'd gotten lost, and he's going to have to spend the night under that limb. But my dad defended me and said, "Troy, no, he didn't get lost. He's a true little Daniel Boone. He would never get lost, at least not for long." It was at that moment that I remembered that I had run off and left Dwayne back in the woods. I explained to Kit and my parents that I did get lost, and Dwayne Mullins came along and led me back home, but I ran off and left him in the woods. My dad said, "Dwayne Mullins?" At this point, my mom, dad, and Kit became silent. After a moment, Kit spoke. "Troy, it couldn't have been Dwayne Mullins." I insisted, though. I told him how he walked up to where I was hiding in a tree, and he seemed to know I was there, even though he can't hear, and even seemed to understand when I told him I was lost and trying to get home to get help for Kit. Again, my statement was met with silence. After a moment, my mom broke the silence. "Troy, Dwayne Mullins was killed by a hit-and-run driver about 2 weeks ago while you were so sick. I saw an article in the newspaper about a little boy getting killed over at Key Farms, and I asked Kit if he knew the boy. He told me that he is a good friend of yours, and since you were so sick, we decided not to tell you about him getting killed. After you got better, I didn't know how to tell you. I was waiting for the right time. Apparently he's trying to cross that busy road that runs past Key Farms, and misjudged how close the vehicle was, and it ran over him. The driver didn't even stop to see if he was hurt. And while there were witnesses that gave description of the car was moving too fast for anyone to be able to get the tag number, so they still haven't caught the driver. This information hit me hard. As a 6-year-old, I'd never known anyone who had died before. This, coupled with the fact that I was sure that the person that led me out of the woods was Dwayne Mullins, left my 6-year-old brain spinning. Kit must have been puzzled too, as he knew I wouldn't lie about such a thing, and he expressed what I'd been thinking. "Do you believe Troy saw a ghost?" My dad remained mute, but my mom answered, "No, I'm sure it's just someone that looked like Dwayne, but it's just too dark for Troy to see that it wasn't Dwayne." I was in a haze and wrapped up in thought that I don't remember what else was said on our way to the hospital, or even if anything else was said. I still think about it from time to time, and while I don't know for sure what I actually saw that evening, I've become convinced that it was an angel that took on the appearance of Dwayne Mullins. This Dwayne would have been someone non-threatening to me, and someone I would trust. My reason is that, as I mentioned earlier in my tale, that I've had many experiences that could have had a much darker ending, but somehow I had been protected. I doubt I would have died from exposure to early balls and falling asleep in the woods, but it is possible, as I was still suffering from some of the lingering effects from the flu. As it turned out, my brother was fine. They x-rayed his leg and determined that he had a fibula shaft fracture. He got a cast. He thought that when school started back, he's going to be able to miss the first few weeks, or, barring that, he'd get pushed around in a wheelchair. But actually, neither happened. He didn't miss any school, and he had to navigate around on crutches. Now, that was an improvement over the last story. It reminded me of a friend that I had who broke his leg in several places. It was so badly damaged that his doctor had to operate and ended up grafting in part of a dog's leg. My friend healed fine. Doesn't even have a limp. But it's hilarious every time he walks past the fire hydrant. Now, that bit about getting stuck on the roof of the house. He should have carried his pet duck with him. That way it would have been easy to get down. You know it's easy to get down from a duck. After all, they're only a few inches high. So Troy's dad was proud of his little Daniel Boone. My father thought the same about me. Many times he would remark to people that he could take me deep into the woods, spin me around blindfolded, and leave me, and I'd still find my way back home. It's true. He did it several times. Oh well, it seems the conductor has just announced we are approaching your stop. I certainly appreciate that you've watched the video and hope that if you thought it was good, please give it a thumbs up. And if you really didn't like it, give it a thumbs down. And if you'll take a moment to leave a comment, especially if you dislike the video, tell me what you do to improve it. Anyway, as my regular habit at this point in the video, I say again, happy rails to you.